now, Cross-Atlantic Crosstalk.
Hi, and welcome to the committee program. And this is Cross-Atlantic Crosstalk with the gang. Ellie Mae O'Hagan, director of the class think tank and friend of the program, and our own deputy director, Julia Doubleday, who is up for what her is an ungodly hour. And what we've done is when we said what time it was, we put no comma between 9:30, so you thought it was 3:30 p.m. So you're upset to be here is what I'm just trying to say.
Yeah, I thought we were going on the air at 3:30 p.m. It is 9:44 a.m.
And here in West Berlin, it is, in fact,
early for me.
3:30 p.m. Yeah. Yes. But anyway, really, really glad to see you both. And it is strange and horrible times that we find ourselves in. And really strange and horrible times to sort of be on the left. You know, as sort of jingoistic things fracture through the culture, I think you probably all have felt it. It becomes sort of hard to take that tenable anti-war position that I think many of us find to be our comfortable space to exist in less perilous times. I mean, how are things in the UK, Ellie specifically? I know a little more about what's going on in the US, but how are people framing the conflict, and how is that affecting the kind of politics around it?
So I think Britain is labouring under the delusion that we won the Second World War single-handedly. That is something that has really influenced a lot of elements of our politics. I mean, ironically, it was kind of Russia that won the Second World War, but like, you know,
a lot of Russian kids died, yeah.
Yeah, that's something that we sort of don't acknowledge at all in the country. And it has led to this sort of very chest-beating, sort of jingoistic mood that takes over whenever the war is on the horizon, and that has really reached a fever pitch in Britain. And so I would divide people broadly into three categories: the left, who are generally pretty worried about the situation and want to kind of negotiate out of it, and also to sort of hit the oligarchs with sanctions and also move away from fossil fuels and disable Putin that way. The government and the right, who actually are being quite sober about the whole thing and are sort of urging caution and saying, you know, we don't want to risk anything that might have terrible consequences. And it's actually the sort of liberal centre that is being incredibly gung-ho and is like...
Same here.
Sort of advocating for, you know, action that they know will result in a possible nuclear conflict and the end of human civilization. And whenever there's any objection to that, people who are objected sort of described as appeasers or a sort of you know, challenged, or what do you want to do? Do you want to sort of sit by and watch like all of these people in Ukraine die, which obviously disguises the fact that like people in Ukraine and many more people in Europe and around the world would die if this conflict were to escalate. You know, so it's I've said it on the show before, and I just said it to you before we started a run, that I think like American public discourse has much more of a sort of freewheeling kind of First Amendment quality to it, which has like upsides that maybe you don't appreciate because you've got rubbish leaders, but I can see them. I feel like it's permissible to say a lot of stuff in America, and the downside of that is you have someone like Marjorie Taylor Greene is like elected to public office, right? Whereas we don't have
that's a downside.
Marjorie Taylor, like we don't have that. We don't have people like her in public office. But what we do have is a group of about 20 people who all went to the same school, who now run the country, and they get to decide what the boundaries, of like what is and isn't acceptable to say, and like you are sort of cast out if you violate any of that. So at the moment, the only sort of permissible opinions are NATO, like unimpeachable, and Russia, and I want to be clear that I mean Russia and not Putin. Russia bad, and the reason that I say Russia and not Putin is there's been some sort of bizarre things like Russian artists being deplatformed regardless of their opinions on Putin, which I think is disgraceful because quite a lot of Russians are very anti-Putin. I don't think it's fair to punish them for who their nation's leader is. And also, there was some debate today about the Manchester Mill and the fact that it has a statue of Engels. Manchester Mill is a newspaper that was set up by, isn't it Engels' father? And it has a statue of Engels outside the front of the headquarters, and there's some sort of debate about should that stay up, which is obviously ridiculous, because if Engels was still alive, he would certainly be on the side of Ukraine and not Putin.
And it's got nothing to do with anything. It's like, how you dragging Engels into this?
No, they
You know?
dragged
Yeah,
Tolstoy
exactly.
into it. They dragged Tolstoy into it. Some
He's at
places
least
were
Russian.
banning War and Peace.
Yeah. Long dead before any of this happened. I mean, I will not make you have to like, get into what the taboos are. I do know that one of them is something. Look, in America, there is a portion of the left that has openly spoken about this conflict brewing because of the militaristic tendencies of NATO, etc. I mean, Julia, how do you think? How are the fractures? Because it's still pretty ugly over on our side. How are those fracturing out in that different way, where we do have the more freewheeling debate?
Well, one, I think that hasn't always been the case in the U.S. Like we as much as we pretend we don't have this strict class system, I think like 90% of our presidents went to an Ivy League college. We, for the most part, also have a small group of elites that went to a small group of schools that are running things. I think it's really been in the last like 5 or 6 years that we've had this really major shift, and part of that was definitely Trump. And that I think also gets at the heart of like what was appealing about Trump to voters, is that like he wasn't this, even though he did go to an Ivy League school, he presented himself as that he was, a normal guy who just was rich because he's smart and can do whatever he wants and say whatever he wants. And there was that backlash where the media was like, oh, well, he can't say this, and kind of try to get rid of him a bunch of times. But it was already too late at that point. I mean, they had already given him so much free airtime. I think like what Labor's been doing with the purges is sort of like the other route that the Democratic Party could have gone, and they chose not to do that. And we're seeing the results of them not purging their party, which is that their party's not completely like dead in the water yet. But they also have like an increasing number of challengers and progressives in their ranks. But to take it back to the internal debate that's happening on the left, I do think there's an element of the left in the U.S. that's, what's the word when you just want to disagree with everything somebody says? Contrarian. They're just sort of like contrarian.
No, they're not. I'm just kidding. See, I did the contrarian thing.
They're contrarian to the degree that they can't even like latch on to what they're talking about anymore. It seems like it's like anything that has to do with the U.S. is the fault of the U.S. The U.S. is bad in just these like very broad sense. Now contrast that with sort of like the media narrative, which is like the U.S. and NATO are unimpeachable. They have nothing to do with this. And also we're going to make tons of false claims, like hundreds a second, about how the Russians are the first to do this, that, and the other, the first to ever invade somebody, the first to ever lie about something, the first to ever violate country's sovereignty. So I think both sides are sort of at fault in the sense that like you see a lot of complaints that the left, is like quote unquote like defending war crimes and this horrible invasion, and I think the vast majority of people on the left are not. But at the same time, when you have people putting forth claims that aren't true and bringing the U.S. into it by saying Russia's the only country to do this, specifically the word only, specifically the first, specifically things that are untrue and are lies, that's when leftists jump in and say, like, that's not true. And that's important to do. So, I mean, that's certainly not the fault of people on the left. If other people are going to make false statements, just don't say those things.
I will say this conversation becomes even more interesting when, and we've had this conversation, like I am in a lot of, like Twitter chat rooms and stuff with folks who aren't necessarily in the imperial core, especially folks from India and Pakistan who I chat with about politics a lot. And their view on this, they have, a similar opinion to some of the contrarian left, except that they've sort of come by it much more honestly, right? Which is just like when they hear the word imperialism spoken by the U.S., it's triggering, right? It's like no, like, the UK and the US does not get to say what imperialism is because y'all are the empire builders. etc. And this word specifically has been this sort of fracture line where it's like, is it possible for a regional bourgeois power like, Russia to commit imperialism against a global imperial power like the United States? And I guess I find that the discourse around that slightly tiresome, but I also do understand it, right? It is just sort of this, you all don't get to own this thing, and they've come by this maybe contrarian opinion, honestly, is how I would say it. I mean, I don't know.
I agree with that from what I've seen, like, on Twitter. I've seen a lot of, like, leftists worldwide being very reactive to what the U.S. is sort of shaping the narrative as. That being said, I think it's a mistake to ally with Putin or to think that he's going to do anything good for the global working class or to think that he wants to do anything positive in the world. It seems like, my own personal opinion is that it seems like he's gone totally nuts. He wants to build an empire. I'm not sure that it's going to stop with Ukraine, especially if he's not confronted. That being said, I also do not want to start a nuclear world war. So I think we're all sort of in this weird space where it's like, we know what happens when people like Putin are sort of given free rein to continue to do whatever they want to do. At the same time, he has his finger on the button. So I think ultimately what it comes down to is just this argument for no nuclear weapons, please, because you're creating an environment where accountability is just totally impossible. I mean, we've also had crazy presidents like President Trump that there was no way to hold this man accountable because he is holding the power to destroy the world several times over. I mean, a lot of people have been saying, well, Putin wouldn't do that, because that's suicidal. And it's like, I mean, he's a megalomaniac. What would Hitler do in a bunker if he was in that bunker and he had the ability to end all life on Earth instead of just killing himself? What do you think sociopathic megalomaniacs, narcissists with, I don't know, every other disorder in the book?
We do not do Hitler fan fiction on the show. That is in your contract, actually. If you read carefully in there, it says that
you think it's fan fiction to say I think that Hitler would rather have destroyed life on Earth?
We don't like to imagine. We don't like to imagine. We don't like to use Hitler as the imaginary example. You know what I'm saying?
Well,
I'm making a Hitler joke in here somehow, and a contract.
Great. Yeah, we love those.
Yeah.
I just think that if Putin is cornered, I don't really know what reason he has to not try and take everyone out.
We just have too many cold warriors on either side, right? People who sort of want and understand the kind of destructive confrontation. It makes me so sad, Ellie, when I'm thinking about it, that somebody like Jeremy Corbyn is not in charge of the Labour Party exactly at a moment like this, because the kind of Cold War skeptics, that generation of folks who kind of also dealt with this, as Julie's saying, nuclear disarmament issue and some of these really underlying fundamental human existential issues just aren't the loud voices in the party.
Yeah, I mean, I don't do Jeremy Corbyn nostalgia. I think it's a sickness that the left needs to get over, because that is gone now, that's done, and I think we need to think about the future and not the past. But yes, I mean, the general point of it, when I was a kid, I was born in the 80s. I was born the year after Chernobyl, and I was born in Wales. And Wales, there was a big cloud of radiation that sort of went over Wales from Chernobyl, and it ended up creating a situation where you couldn't eat meat that was grown in my area for 10 years because of the radiation. And so when I was a kid, nuclear power and nuclear weapons were big. You learned about them in school and what they were capable of. And I remember when Jacques Chirac commissioned loads of nuclear tests off the coast of New Zealand, my whole class wrote letters to him telling him how terrible it was to be doing that and that he needed to stop. We were all 10 years old, and our teacher got us all together and got us to do it. And I just think that over the years in this country, the sort of nuclear weapons have become something that you're expected as a leader to just accept in order to sort of move the territory onto bread and butter issues that affect people's everyday lives. And that's why even Jeremy Corbyn agreed to keep Trident, like Britain's nuclear deterrent, even though it's like that is something that he's devoted his whole life to campaigning against, was Trident, because such is the level of consensus about, like, I wouldn't say that the
serious people believe a set of beliefs around how this kind of thing is supposed to work.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, God knows what will happen with this situation now, but I'm really hoping that, like, if we make it through it in one piece, it will force people to think about the reality of having nuclear weapons. Because as Julia said, like, you know, now, like, a crazy, increasingly isolated dictator who's surrounded by yes men has got, like, the biggest nuclear arsenal in the world, and that's like it's insane that we've, like, ended up in that position, you know. So yeah, I hope that at least that is something that comes out of this.
I think something that will come out of this also, though, which unfortunately probably does not help nuclear non-proliferation, would be the kind of story that's happened, which is every country that's been asked by, especially the West, to give up its nuclear weapons has found itself in trouble. You know, whether that be Libya, certainly for different reasons than Ukraine, but there may be it might be much harder for people to sort of have that conversation in a non-multipolar way, which is, of course, all the more reason to engage in true multipolarism in negotiations in the world. But I mean, I don't know. It seems hard, and it seems to me, Julie, that like Joe Biden and Kamala Harris kind of, I mean, I don't know. I actually haven't watched all of Biden's response speeches. I just see the bits. I know that they give him the good drugs before they send him out there. But it seems to be falling into sort of just really familiar kind of State Department habits. They seem to be just sort of doing the Cold War stuff that they're comfortable with.
Yeah, I mean, I've been honestly pleasantly surprised that there hasn't been talk of a direct confrontation at this point. I've been concerned about a direct confrontation between Russia and the U.S. for the last, like, 6 years. I also think that's one of the reasons that the left essentially sort of came under fire in the wake of this invasion, is that a lot of people on the left were focused on U.S. anti-imperialism right ahead of the invasion. I feel like for myself, I, wasn't really publicly talking about it because I didn't feel that confident about anything, but privately did not think that Russia would invade. I didn't think they would bomb Kyiv. I didn't think it would be this, like, full-on invasion because it just seems so not strategic. It seemed like something that U.S. intelligence was just sort of telling us, and I think that's sort of a boy who cried wolf situation that the left can't be blamed for. I mean, they've lied to us continuously, so no, I don't usually believe things they say. In this case, it was true. And I think the left had to do this sort of, like, hard pivot to being like, oh, okay, well, if this is actually happening, no, of course we're not for this. And then there are people, around that you've mentioned before, there are people who do seem to be what they call the, like, so-called pro-Putin left, but I think it's, like, very overblown. I think it's particularly concentrated among a few very online people who essentially this is their entire brand, and they either, out of protection of that brand, out of cognitive dissonance, like, need to keep doubling down on whatever they had said previously. But for the most part, I haven't seen any sort of, like, full-throated defenses of Putin. I think to a great degree that's overblown.
And I mean, I guess is what's leading towards isolation, as you're both describing it. I guess the other thing that I would wonder, sort of coming out of this, is what are the constructive ways for a progressive left to engage, right? To initiate a peace movement. Is it concentrating on the kind of mechanics of NATO, what this means is a thing? I mean, how does one present something that is a fair solution when both sides are just sort of looking to save face, right? It is a communications war, almost as much as it is anything at this point.
I don't know. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, go on.
I said I don't know, so why don't you start?
We had an anti-war movement in Britain for Iraq, which, like, I was a teenager. I was part of it as a teenager, but we sort of came together. We had huge demonstrations, and you know, I remember my mum took me to all these like little demonstrations in our little town, and we did lots of things, and then it sort of it kind of the sort of mass movement element of it kind of dissipated, and I think that was that had a very sort of strong undercurrent, the Iraq War anti-war movement, of being opposed to American imperialism, and that was the sort of like ideological underpinning, I guess, of the movement, which is obviously, you know, makes sense. But I think now what we need is a sort of renewed anti-war movement that is not that's the underpinning of which is just anti-imperialism, like regardless of where it's coming from, because, you know, otherwise that does lead us into this sort of strange place of that anyone who isn't an American imperialist is my friend kind of thing, which is very morally bankrupt. So yeah, I think what we need to do now is to, like, Owen Jones wrote this in The Guardian, is to like come together and create a sort of renewed anti-war movement. Easier said than done.
Easier said than done. I think there needs to be communication between regular people in all these countries. I mean, I've been saying for a while, like, these borders don't exist for rich people. They don't exist for governments. They just exist for us. They impede us. They make it impossible for us to communicate. They make it impossible for us to adequately organize against a power structure that is multinational, that is global, that an economic system that is global, that is administered often through these international bodies. In the meantime, you know, we have no connection to anybody, you know, outside of our own, you know, national discourse. And I think that needs to change. But I do, you know, of course, we're living in this world that they built that has so many legal, national and international legal boundaries to how you communicate and how you organize. But, you know, I saw this Ukrainian woman had posted a piece about how frustrating it is to see the American left so focused on American anti-imperialism, even at this time. And the example she used was, I agreed with some of the stuff she was talking about, and she did talk about advocating for global movements. But she also said something about how, what if in 2003, she gave this like hypothetical, in 2003 when the US was invading Iraq, what if the Russian left was only focused on Russian imperialism and hadn't been advocating against the Iraq war? And I actually felt that was a good case study from my own point of view, because she seemed to be advocating for Russia to engage with the Americans and to escalate the conflict. And personally, I think that's a great example of how that wouldn't have helped. Like, it wouldn't have helped that situation, the invasion in Iraq, to have Russia also come into Iraq, threatening to nuke Americans. I think that would have really escalated the conflict. I don't think it would have saved a lot of lives in the Middle East. It could have potentially led to nuclear conflict 15 years ago. I mean, I don't really understand the argument that the escalation is going to save lives, unless you can make that case for how it's going to do that, without causing more war, more violence, more death. So, you know, I just think that we're in a really hard situation, and for people on the left, obviously, our underlying goal is anti-imperialism and anti-war. And for the Russian left in 2003, I think the best thing they could do would be to continue to draw focus onto the crimes of their own government. And I think in this case, that also is a productive thing that Americans can do, because the reality is we don't exist in a vacuum. We're living in a heavily propagandized nation where people are getting plenty of important information about what the Russians are doing in Ukraine. We're getting that wall to wall. So the idea that every single leftist has to go around repeating the propaganda from morning to night and there's no time to talk about anything else, of course, it's just part of this ideological project to get everybody saying the same thing at the same time. And and to pardon yourself in the process, whitewash yourself in the process. You know, we've seen a lot of prominent people in the US, including like one guy went very viral because he's a congressional advisor, and he tweeted that there had never been, he was racking his brains and he could think of no people who had ever resisted an occupier like Ukraine was doing, which is of course erasure of like thousands and thousands of movements all over the world for, you know, against occupation and against colonialism. And he still hasn't taken it down, I don't think, even though he went very, very viral for that kind of claim. But so that's the kind of thing that we have to call out, because all of these struggles are interconnected. It doesn't make sense for us to oppose what Putin's doing and then continue to deny our own role in the bombing that's happening in Yemen. We have to acknowledge that, and we have to also put an end to that. And we have much more power over that situation in Yemen. So, of course, that's why it doesn't get talked about.
Yeah. Yeah. No. These connections don't seem to get made in the discourse. And because we're able to sort of flood the field, we don't actually have time to look at that big picture. But thank you both for helping us do so. Ellie Mayo-Hagan in the UK with the Class Think Tank, and Julia, why don't you tell us what you're starting to do consulting? Can you tell us exactly what you're going to be doing? Give a little plug for yourself.
Sure. Yeah, I've been working a little bit with Matriarch, which is Nomiki's organization, and then I've been also doing some deep coaching for campaigns. So essentially just helping them ensure that they're structured properly. A big thing I focus on is how the campaigns are organized, how the different departments are organized, how they communicate with each other, their staffing. I have experience on the data side, field side, comm side. I've run a campaign. So essentially making sure all those departments are functioning and also functioning with each other. So that's the kind of stuff I've been doing in the last couple months.
And we will hear more about it, and we will see you in the next segment where we get into the highbrow, lowbrow stuff. So everyone, stick around. Thank you so much.